The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of my childhood bedroom, casting long shadows across boxes I hadn't touched in 3 years. My name is Marcus, and at 34, I found myself back in the house where I grew up in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, sorting through the remnants of a life that felt both familiar and foreign. Mom had been gone for 6 months now. Cancer took her quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes, too slowly for her not to suffer. The house, a modest 2-story colonial with peeling white paint and a front porch that creaked in winter winds, had been sitting empty while I gathered the courage to face this moment. I picked up a shoebox filled with greeting cards, the kind of sentimental collection only mothers keep. Birthday cards from when I was 7, Christmas cards from distant relatives, thank you notes for casseroles brought during Dad's funeral 5 years earlier. Each card was a timestamp, a frozen moment of connection in our increasingly disconnected world. That's when I saw it. A cream-colored envelope, heavier than the others, with my name written in elegant cursive. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but something about it made my chest tighten. I turned it over and saw it was sealed, unopened. Strange. Mom opened everything. The return address read, Eleanor Whitman, 1247 Maple Street, Cleveland Heights, OH. I knew that name. Eleanor Whitman had been our neighbor when I was 12, the year everything fell apart, the year Dad lost his job at the steel mill, the year we almost lost the house, the year I learned that adults could cry and that grown-ups didn't always have the answers. Mrs. Whitman lived 3 houses down in a Victorian that looked like something from a fairy tale, painted lavender with intricate white trim. She had a garden that burst with flowers, even in Ohio's harsh climate, and she always smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. But what I remembered most was her kindness during our family's darkest months. I held the envelope up to the light. It was thick, definitely containing more than just a card. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal, 22 years after it had been given to me. Inside was indeed a card, a simple one with a watercolor painting of a sunrise over a lake. But it was what fell out that made me sink onto the edge of my childhood bed. A check made out to me, dated August 15th, 2002. The amount made me blink hard and look again, $50,000. The card's message was written in the same elegant script. Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to what matters. This isn't charity. It's an investment in a future I believe you can build. Your mother was too proud to accept help, but she wasn't too proud to accept hope. Use this wisely, but more importantly, use it with the same kindness you showed me when your family had nothing to give but compassion. The sunrise always comes, even after the longest nights. With love and faith in your tomorrow, Eleanor Whitman. Below that, in a different pen, clearly added later, P.S. Uki, if something happens to me before you find this, know that watching you grow into the man you've become has been one of my greatest joys. Don't let the world make you forget the boy who helped an old woman with her groceries when his own family was struggling to put food on the table. And I sat there in the gathering dusk, holding a piece of paper that represented more money than I'd ever seen at once, but more than that, holding proof that someone had believed in me when I was just a 12-year-old kid whose biggest worry was whether we'd have electricity that month. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 34 years old, 3 months behind on my rent for a studio apartment in downtown Cleveland, working 2 part-time jobs just to make ends meet, sitting in a house I'd inherited but couldn't afford to maintain, holding a check that was older than some of my co-workers. I pulled out my phone and did what any millennial does when faced with the impossible. I Googled Eleanor Whitman. The obituary was from 2018. She had passed away at 87, surrounded by the flowers from her famous garden, which had been donated to the Cleveland Botanical Garden in her memory. The article mentioned her work as a retired elementary school teacher, her volunteer work with local food banks, and her reputation for helping struggling families in the neighborhood. No mention of family, no mention of the quiet generosity that had just changed my life. I walked to the window and looked toward where her house used to be. A modern townhouse complex stood there now, all sharp angles and vinyl siding, nothing like the whimsical Victorian that had housed so much warmth. My phone buzzed. A text from my landlord. Marcus, rent is now 5 days late. Need payment by tomorrow or we start eviction process. I looked at the check again. Even if it was still valid after all these years, even if the bank account still existed, even if this wasn't some cosmic joke, would it be right to cash it? Mrs. Whitman had been gone for 6 years. Maybe this money was meant to go to her estate, to charity, to someone who needed it more than I did. But her words echoed in my mind. This isn't charity. It's an investment in a future I believe you can build. Who? What future had that 12-year-old boy dreamed of? What had I wanted to become before life taught me to dream smaller, to expect less, to settle for survival instead of reaching for something more? The house creaked around me as night fell, and I realized I wasn't just holding a check, I was holding a choice between the man I'd become and the man someone had once believed I could be. I carefully placed the check back in the card and walked downstairs to the kitchen. Mom's address book was still by the phone, filled with contact information that was probably older than my smartphone. I flipped through it until I found what I was looking for. Eleanor Whitman, written in Mom's familiar handwriting, with a phone number that had been crossed out and updated several times over the years. Tomorrow, I would start making calls. I would track down Mrs. Whitman's lawyers, her estate, anyone who could tell me if cashing this check was the right thing to do. But tonight, for the first time in months, I would sleep in my childhood bed and dream about the future instead of worrying about tomorrow's bills. Outside, the Cleveland winter wind rattled the windows, but inside, something had shifted. The weight of forgotten things sometimes turns out to be lighter than we remember, and sometimes they turn out to be exactly what we need to carry us forward. As I turned off the lights, I whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, for believing in me when I forgot how to believe in myself. The sunrise always comes, even after the longest nights." The law office of Peterson, Muller and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator wheezed between floors, and the carpet in the hallway had been worn thin by countless clients seeking justice, closure, or in my case, answers about a check that defied explanation. It had been a week since I'd found Mrs. Whitman's card, and I'd spent every free moment between my shifts at the coffee shop and my evening job cleaning office buildings trying to track down information about her estate. The internet had yielded frustratingly little. No family members, no will on public record, no obvious heirs to a woman who had clearly been far more generous than her modest teacher's pension should have allowed. Mr. Henderson? The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from her computer. "Mr. Peterson will see you now." James Peterson looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for small-town lawyer. Rumpled suit, coffee-stained tie, and a desk buried under enough paperwork to deforest a small state. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes were sharp behind glasses that had slipped down his nose. "So," he said, settling back in his chair that squeaked with every movement, "you're asking about Eleanor Whitman. Haven't heard that name in a while. You knew her." "Knew her? Hell, she was one of my first clients when I started this practice 30 years ago. Eleanor was something else, sharp as a tack, stubborn as a mule, and had more tricks up her sleeve than a Vegas magician." He chuckled, the kind of laugh that comes with fond memories. "What's your connection to her?" I explained about finding the card, about the check, about my family's history with Mrs. Whitman. Peterson listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a legal pad that had seen better days. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Cleveland skyline that looked gray and tired under the February sky. 22 years, he finally said. "She made that check out 22 years ago. You knew about it?" "Not specifically, no, but it doesn't surprise me." He opened a filing cabinet that protested with a screech of metal on metal. "Eleanor had unconventional approaches to helping people. Always worried about pride, about people feeling like charity cases. She'd find ways to help that felt like something else, a business opportunity, a loan, a delayed gift. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the desk between us. When Eleanor passed in 2018, she left very specific instructions. Most of her estate went to educational charities, but there were provisions for what she called outstanding investments in human potential. What does that mean? It means, Marcus, that you weren't her only project. Peterson flipped through the folder, revealing dozens of documents, photocopies of checks, and handwritten notes. Over 30 years, Eleanor Whitman quietly helped more than 200 families in Cleveland. Sometimes it was paying a medical bill, sometimes it was covering rent during a rough patch, sometimes it was funding someone's education. He pulled out a photograph, Mrs. Whitman standing in her garden, surrounded by a group of people of various ages. I recognized some faces from the neighborhood, people I'd grown up around. This was taken at her 75th birthday party. Every person in this photo was someone she'd helped. She called them her garden, people she'd planted seeds in, hoping they'd grow into something beautiful. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. So the check is absolutely legitimate. Eleanor set up a trust specifically for situations like this. Money set aside for checks that might surface years later, interest calculated, provisions made. He pulled out another document. In fact, with accumulated interest over 22 years, that $50,000 check is now worth approximately $78,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. That's impossible. Eleanor was a teacher, but she was also smart with money. She inherited her parents' house free and clear, lived modestly, invested wisely, and spent most of her retirement giving away the proceeds. Peterson leaned forward. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Before I could answer, he continued, because there's a catch. There's always a catch with Eleanor's gifts. What kind of catch? Peterson smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd had this conversation before. You have to use it in a way that helps someone else. That was Eleanor's rule. Her gifts weren't just about helping the recipient, they were about creating a chain of kindness that would keep going long after she was gone. He handed me a letter, sealed but addressed to me in Mrs. Whitman's handwriting. She left this with specific instructions that it'd only be given to you if you came looking for information about the check. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was longer than the card, written on the same cream-colored stationery that somehow smelled faintly of vanilla even after all these years. My dear Marcus, it began. If you're reading this letter, it means you found your way to Mr. Peterson's office, which means you're the responsible young man I always believed you'd become. You could have simply cashed the check and asked no questions, but you didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. I'm writing this on my 80th birthday, sitting in my garden, thinking about all the seeds I've planted over the years. Some grew into mighty trees, some into beautiful flowers, and some are still growing in ways I may never see. You, Marcus, were always going to be one of my mighty trees. I could see it in the way you treated others, even when your own family was struggling. The money I'm giving you isn't payment for anything you've done. It's an investment in what you're going to do. I know life has been harder than you expected. I know you've had to put aside dreams to handle responsibilities. I know you've probably forgotten some of the things you once wanted to accomplish. This is your reminder. This is your chance to remember who you wanted to be before the world told you to be practical, to be realistic, to settle for less than your dreams. But here's what I need from you. Whatever you do with this gift, make sure it creates opportunities for others too. Start a business that employs people. Go to school and then teach others. Create something that makes your community better. The exact choice is yours, but the principle is non-negotiable. Lift as you climb. I won't be around to see what you build, but I have absolute faith that it will be something beautiful. With all my love and confidence in your future, Eleanor Whitman. P.S. Check the envelope. There's one more thing. I looked back in the envelope. and found a small key, old and brass, with a tag that had an address I didn't recognize. Peterson was watching me with an expression that suggested he knew what I'd found. "Storage unit," he explained. "Eleanor rented it specifically for items she wanted certain people to have. The address is about 10 minutes from here. What's in it? I honestly don't know. Eleanor was very secretive about some things, but knowing her, it's probably exactly what you need, even if you don't know what that is yet." I sat there for a moment, overwhelmed by the generosity of a woman I'd barely known as a child, humbled by her faith in a future I couldn't yet see, and terrified by the responsibility of living up to her expectations. "Mr. Peterson," I said finally, "what did she see in all of us? What made her believe we were worth this kind of investment?" He leaned back in his squeaky chair and smiled. "Marcus, I asked her that same question once. You want to know what she told me?" I nodded. "She said that kindness recognizes kindness, that people who help others when they have nothing to give are the ones who'll move mountains when they have the resources to do it. She said the best investments aren't in businesses or stocks. They're in people who understand that success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you make possible for others." As I left the law office, key in my pocket and check carefully folded in my wallet, I realized that Mrs. Whitman had given me more than money. She'd given me a responsibility, a purpose, and a challenge that would define whatever came next. The storage unit was waiting, holding secrets from a woman who had seen potential in a 12-year-old boy and bet her money on the man he might become. Cleveland's winter wind felt less bitter as I walked to my car, carrying the weight of possibility instead of the burden of survival. The Cleveland self-storage facility sat on the edge of town like a fortress of forgotten things, row after row of identical orange doors holding the overflow of people's lives. Unit 47 was in the back corner, tucked away from the main thoroughfare where trucks rumbled past carrying salt and snow plows that had been working overtime this particularly brutal Ohio winter. I'd been staring at the lock for 5 minutes, key in hand, suddenly afraid of what I might find. Mrs. Whitman had been full of surprises so far, and I wasn't sure my emotional state could handle many more revelations about the depth of her generosity or her faith in my potential. The key turned easily, and the door rolled up with a metallic screech that echoed off the concrete walls. What I found inside wasn't what I'd expected. The unit was organized with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years teaching third graders. Everything in its place, everything labeled, everything purposeful. But it wasn't furniture or household items. It was dreams, literally. Against the far wall stood a large corkboard covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. As I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. The futures of Mrs. Whitman's investments. There was Maria Santos, who had used Eleanor's help to finish nursing school and now ran a free clinic in the Latino community. There was James Washington, whose restaurant employed 30 people and donated meals to the homeless shelter every Sunday. There was Sarah Chen, whose tutoring program had helped hundreds of kids improve their grades and their confidence. Each section of the board was dedicated to a different person, chronicling not just their initial struggles, but their eventual successes, and more importantly, how they'd used their success to help others. It was like looking at a family tree of kindness, branches spreading out in directions Mrs. Whitman couldn't have predicted, but had somehow known would grow. In the center of the board, there was a space labeled Marcus Henderson, with just a few items: a photo of me from middle school, where had she gotten that? A copy of an essay I'd written in 8th grade about wanting to be a teacher, and a newspaper clipping from my high school graduation, where I'd been quoted talking about wanting to make a difference in kids' lives. Below that, in her careful handwriting, "Still waiting for this story to unfold." I turned away from the board, blinking back tears I hadn't expected, and noticed the rest of the unit's contents. There were boxes labeled with years, filing cabinets full of documents, and in the corner, something that made me catch my breath. easels, art supplies, and a stack of canvases covered with a paint-splattered sheet. I pulled back the sheet and found myself looking at paintings, dozens of them, all by Mrs. Whitman. They weren't masterpieces, but they were beautiful in their honesty. Scenes from the neighborhood, portraits of people I recognized, landscapes of places that looked like Ohio, but somehow more hopeful, more colorful than the gray reality I knew. And then I found the painting that stopped me cold. It was me, at 12 years old, helping Mrs. Whitman carry groceries from her car to her house. I remembered that day vividly. Mom had sent me over to see if Mrs. Whitman needed anything from the store, and I'd ended up spending 2 hours helping her organize her pantry and listening to stories about her students. I'd thought it was just being neighborly, but she'd seen something worth preserving, worth remembering, worth painting. In the bottom corner, she'd written, "Marcus, age 12, the day I knew." I sat down heavily on a folding chair that had been set up as if she'd expected I might need a moment to process all of this. On a small table next to the chair, there was an envelope with my name on it and a manila folder labeled Business Plan, Community Education Center. The envelope contained another letter, shorter this time, but no less impactful. "Marcus, if you've made it this far, you're probably overwhelmed. I understand. When someone believes in you more than you believe in yourself, it can feel like a burden as much as a gift. Let me tell you what I see when I look at that painting of you at 12. I see a young man who helped an old woman with her groceries, not because his mother told him to, but because he saw someone who needed help. I see someone who spent 2 hours of his Saturday organizing shelves for a neighbor he barely knew. I see someone who listened to an old woman's stories with genuine interest, not just politeness. That's who you were at 12, and I'm betting that's still who you are at 34, even if life has taught you to hide it sometimes. The folder contains a business plan I've been working on for 15 years. It's for a community education center that would serve families like yours was. Families where the kids are smart and capable, but don't have access to the resources that make success easier. After-school tutoring, adult education classes, job training programs, college preparation, financial literacy, all the things that can change a family's trajectory if someone just cares enough to provide them. I'm too old to start this now, and I was never the right person anyway. I was good at planting seeds, but I was never much of a gardener. This needs someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone who knows how to help without making people feel helpless. This needs you, Marcus. The money I'm giving you is seed money, enough to get started, to rent a space, to hire a few people, to prove the concept works. But more than that, it's a vote of confidence in your ability to be the person I've always known you could be. You don't have to do this. You could take the money and pay off your debts and live more comfortably, and I wouldn't blame you. But I think you know deep down that comfortable was never what you were meant for. If you decide to move forward with this, look in the blue folder on the bottom shelf. I've already done some of the legwork, contacted potential funders, identified possible locations, even talked to some people who might want to help. All it needs is someone brave enough to say yes to a bigger dream. Whatever you decide, know that watching you grow up has been one of the great privileges of my life, and I have complete faith in whatever path you choose. With love and unwavering belief in your potential, Eleanor. I set the letter down with shaking hands and found the blue folder she'd mentioned. Inside was a comprehensive business plan that must have represented hundreds of hours of work. Market research, financial projections, curriculum outlines, staffing plans, partnership agreements with local schools and community organizations. It was brilliant. It was thorough. It was exactly the kind of program that could have changed my family's life when I was growing up. And it was terrifying. I'd been working dead-end jobs for years, barely keeping my head above water, and she was asking me to run a non-profit organization that would serve hundreds of families. I didn't have an MBA. I didn't have experience managing people or programs or budgets. But as I read through the business plan, I realized something. I had something more valuable than credentials. I had lived, experience. I knew exactly what these families would be going through because I'd been one of these kids. I knew what it felt like to be smart enough to succeed, but not have anyone show you how. I knew what it felt like to watch your parents work multiple jobs and still struggle to make ends meet. I knew what it felt like to have dreams, but no roadmap for achieving them. I picked up one of Mrs. Whitman's paintings, a landscape of Cleveland that somehow looked hopeful despite the grey sky, and studied her brushstrokes. She hadn't been a professional artist, but she'd painted with love, with attention, with care for every detail. Maybe that was enough. Maybe love and attention and care were more important than expertise when it came to helping people. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. David Rodriguez, a guy I'd gone to high school with who now worked for the city's community development department. We'd reconnected on social media, but hadn't talked in years. My finger hovered over the call button. Once I made this call, once I started asking questions about locations and permits and funding, there would be no going back. This would stop being Mrs. Whitman's dream and start becoming my responsibility. The storage unit was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the sound of my own heartbeat. I looked around at the evidence of one woman's faith in her community, at the documentation of all the lives she'd touched, at the painting of a 12-year-old boy who had helped carry groceries and somehow inspired a legacy. I pressed call. David? Hey, it's Marcus Henderson from high school. Listen, I know this might sound crazy, but I need to talk to someone about starting a community education center, and I thought you might be able to point me in the right direction. As David's voice filled the storage unit with questions and enthusiasm and offers to help, I realized that Mrs. Whitman had given me more than money or even opportunity. She'd given me permission to believe in myself the way she'd always believed in me. The hardest part wasn't going to be finding a location or writing grant proposals or hiring staff. The hardest part was going to be living up to the faith of a woman who had seen my potential before I even knew I had any. But maybe that was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been avoiding my whole life. And maybe it was exactly what I needed to become the person I was meant to be. The afternoon light filtering through the storage unit's single window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment it looked like magic. Not the supernatural kind that changes everything instantly, but the real kind that comes from one person believing in another, from small acts of kindness that compound over time, from the courage to say yes to something bigger than your fears. I had work to do. 18 months later, I stood in the doorway of what had once been an abandoned department store on East 55th Street, watching pure chaos unfold in the most beautiful way possible. 12-year-old Destiny Williams was helping 8-year-old Marcus Thompson. Yes, we had our own Marcus now, with his math homework, while her mother, Janet, practiced for her GED test in the adult education room. Meanwhile, in the computer lab, 17-year-old Carlos Mendez was teaching a group of senior citizens how to use email so they could communicate with their grandchildren who had moved away for college. The Henderson Community Learning Center, named not after me, but after my family, because as I'd learned from Mrs. Whitman, the best legacies are the ones that acknowledge everyone who helped build them, had become something I never could have imagined when I'd made that first phone call from the storage unit. Mr. Marcus. The voice belonged to Aiden Parker, a 10-year-old bundle of energy whose family had been our first students. Come look at what I made. I followed him to the art corner, where he'd recreated Mrs. Whitman's painting of me carrying groceries, except in his version, it was him helping his elderly neighbor Mrs. Johnson with her shopping bags. The style was pure elementary school, stick figures and bold colors, and a sun that took up a quarter of the sky. But the intention was perfect. That's beautiful, Aiden. What made you want to paint that? Mrs. Sarah told us about the lady who started this place, how she helped people, and they helped other people. And then those people helped more people. I wanted to show that I'm part of the chain now too. Mrs. Sarah was Sarah Martinez, our art therapist, and one of Mrs. Whitman's success stories. She'd used Eleanor's help to finish her degree in social work, and when I'd called her about joining our staff, she'd cried on the phone for 10 minutes before saying yes. "You absolutely are part of the chain," I told Aidan, ruffling his hair, "and I think Mrs. Whitman would be very proud of this painting." The centre had started small, just me, 2 part-time tutors, and 12 students meeting in a rented church basement. But word spread the way good news does in communities that don't get much of it. Parents told other parents. Teachers recommended us to families who were struggling. Kids brought their friends. The breakthrough had come when Janet Williams, Destiny's mother, got her GED and immediately enrolled in the community college's nursing program. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly we had more volunteers than we knew what to do with, including several retired teachers who said they'd been looking for a way to give back. That's when I learned Mrs. Whitman's most important lesson. When you create something that genuinely helps people, the community will rally around it in ways you never expected. The funding had come together like puzzle pieces. The initial check from Mrs. Whitman covered our first year of operations, but by month 8, we had grants from 3 foundations, a partnership with the school district, and a waiting list of families who wanted to join our programs. More importantly, we had results. Our students' grades improved by an average of 1.2 letter grades within 6 months. 93% of our high school seniors went on to post-secondary education or job training programs. 67 adults had completed their GED or high school equivalency through our evening classes, but the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't tell the real story. The real story was in moments like watching Carlos teach computer skills to seniors, in seeing Janet Williams walk across the stage at her nursing school graduation, in Aidan's painting that showed he understood the power of helping others. "Marcus?" The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen, the retired principal who had become our volunteer coordinator and my unofficial mentor in running educational programs. "There's someone here to see you." I looked toward the front door and saw a woman in her 40s, well-dressed but nervous, holding the hand of a boy who looked about 8 years old and was trying to hide behind her legs. "That's Melissa Foster," Dr. Chen whispered. "She heard about us from Janet Williams, single mom, works 2 jobs, just moved here from Akron. Her son Tommy is gifted but struggling in school because he's bored and acting out." I walked over to introduce myself and immediately saw the familiar mix of hope and skepticism in Melissa's eyes, the look of a parent who has been disappointed before but is desperate enough to try one more time. "Ms. Foster, I'm Marcus Henderson. Janet told me a little about your situation. Would you like to look around and see what we're about?" As I showed them through the center, I watched Tommy's demeanor change. His eyes lit up when he saw the science corner with its microscopes and rock collection. He perked up when he noticed the chessboards where kids were playing with adult volunteers. He actually smiled when Carlos showed him how to code a simple computer game. "The program is free," I explained to Melissa as Tommy got absorbed in trying to program his name to scroll across the computer screen. "We provide after-school tutoring, homework help, enrichment activities, and college prep for older kids. For parents, we offer GED classes, financial literacy workshops, and job training programs." "What's the catch?" Melissa asked, and I heard the voice of experience, someone who had learned that free help usually comes with strings attached. "No catch, but we do ask families to contribute to the community in whatever way they can. Some parents volunteer as tutors if they have skills to share. Some help with fundraising or administrative work. Some contribute by sharing their stories with potential funders. Everyone gives what they can. And if I can't give anything, then you give your son the chance to succeed. And when he does, hopefully he'll help the next kid who needs it. That's how Mrs. Whitman's chain works." I told Melissa about Mrs. Whitman, about the check I'd found, about the business plan that had made all of this possible. I showed her the photo gallery we'd created, featuring success stories from our students and their families. "Why do you do this?" Melissa asked, as Tommy continued to be fascinated by the computer programming tutorial. It was a question I'd been asked many times by reporters and funders and curious visitors. The easy answer was that Mrs. Whitman had given me the money and the plan. But the real answer was more complicated. When I was Tommy's age, my family was struggling. My dad had lost his job, we were behind on our mortgage, and I was scared we were going to lose our house. There was this neighbor, Mrs. Whitman, who helped us in ways we didn't even realize at the time. She never made us feel like charity cases. She just believed in us when we forgot how to believe in ourselves. I looked around the center, at kids doing homework with college volunteers, at adults practicing for job interviews, at the art wall covered with drawings that showed these families' dreams and hopes. I spent 20 years forgetting what Mrs. Whitman had taught me, that sometimes the best investment you can make is in someone else's potential. This place exists because she saw something in a 12-year-old boy who helped her carry groceries. Now I get to see that same something in kids like Tommy, in parents like you, in anyone who walks through that door looking for a chance. Melissa was quiet for a moment, watching her son explain to Carlos how he'd modified the computer program to make his name flash in different colors. "When can he start?" she asked. 3 hours later, after Tommy had been enrolled and oriented and introduced to several potential friends, after Melissa had signed up for our financial literacy workshop and agreed to help with our newsletter since she had experience in graphic design, I found myself alone in the center for the first time in weeks. I walked through the rooms, turning off lights and straightening chairs, taking in the evidence of a dream that had become reality. On my desk, I kept Mrs. Whitman's original letter and the photograph of 12-year-old me helping her with groceries. Some days, when the challenges of running a non-profit felt overwhelming, I'd read her words again. The sunrise always comes, even after the longest nights. She'd been right about so many things, but mostly she'd been right about the power of believing in people. Every success story in our center had started with someone, a teacher, a parent, a volunteer, a friend, believing in someone else's potential before they believed in it themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from David Rodriguez, who had helped me navigate the city bureaucracy and had become both a friend and a board member. Just saw the Channel 5 story about the center. Eleanor would be so proud. I looked up at the painting Aidan had made, at his stick figure representation of kindness being passed from one person to another, and realized that Mrs. Whitman's greatest gift hadn't been the check or the business plan, or even the storage unit full of dreams. Her greatest gift had been showing me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide to invest in each other. As I locked up and walked to my car, I passed the spot where Mrs. Whitman's house used to stand. The townhouse complex that had replaced it was nice enough, but it lacked the character, the warmth, the sense of possibility that had emanated from that old Victorian with its impossible garden. But maybe that was okay. Maybe Mrs. Whitman's real legacy wasn't in bricks and mortar. It was in the ripple effects of kindness, in the chain of people helping people that stretched far beyond what any single house could contain. I thought about tomorrow's schedule. A grant presentation to the Cleveland Foundation, a meeting with the school board about expanding our tutoring program, interviews with 3 potential new staff members, and somewhere in between, helping Tommy Foster with his science project and checking on Janet Williams as she prepared for her nursing board exams. It was exactly the kind of busy, meaningful, overwhelming, rewarding life that 12-year-old me had dreamed of having when I'd written that essay about wanting to make a difference. It was the life Mrs. Whitman had seen in that boy helping with groceries, the life she'd invested in with a check that waited 22 years to change everything. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd started doing every night since the center opened. I took a photo of our sign, illuminated by the streetlight, with the inscription underneath that read, "In memory of Eleanor Whitman, who believed in the power of small kindnesses to change the world." Then I sent the photo to the group chat I maintained with all of Mrs. Whitman's investments: Maria from the free clinic, James from the restaurant, Sarah who taught art therapy at our center, and 37 others who had found their way to each other through shared gratitude for a woman who had seen their potential before they did. The responses came back immediately. "Beautiful as always, Marcus. She'd be so proud. Another day, another chance to pass it forward. Thank you for keeping her spirit alive." As I drove home through the quiet Cleveland streets, I realized that Mrs. Whitman had solved the eternal puzzle of how to live forever. You invest in people who invest in other people, and suddenly your kindness becomes immortal, growing and multiplying long after you're gone. The check had been worth $78,000, but the interest it had earned in human lives was incalculable. Tommy Foster would grow up knowing that someone believed in his potential. Melissa Foster would build a better life for her family because someone had given her the tools to succeed. The volunteers who worked at our center would go home each day knowing they'd made a difference. The college students who tutored our kids would carry those experiences into their careers and their own families. And somewhere, in some future I couldn't yet imagine, one of our students would find themselves in a position to help someone else, and they'd remember the place where someone first showed them that they mattered, that they had potential, that they were worth investing in. The chain would continue, link by link, act of kindness by act of kindness, dream by dream. I pulled into the driveway of the house I'd inherited from Mom. The house I could now afford to maintain and improve thanks to the stability the center had brought to my life. But more than that, it was the house where a 12-year-old boy had learned that neighbors help each other, that small acts of kindness matter, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is carry someone's groceries. Inside, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to work on the grant application that was due tomorrow. But first, I pulled out a piece of Mrs. Whitman's cream-colored stationery that I'd taken from the storage unit, and I wrote a letter of my own. Dear future Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you've made it further than you thought possible when you were 34. And scared and working 2 part-time jobs just to survive. It means Mrs. Whitman was right about you, even when you weren't sure she was right about anything. I hope you remember where this all started, not with the check, but with the choice to help an old woman with her groceries when your family had nothing to give but compassion. I hope you remember that success isn't measured by what you achieve, but by what you make possible for others. I hope you're still taking photos of the sign every night, still sending updates to Mrs. Whitman's extended family, still believing in 12-year-olds who remind you of yourself. Most of all, I hope you remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide to invest in each other. The sunrise always comes, even after the longest nights. With love and faith in tomorrow, Marcus, age 35. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept Mrs. Whitman's original card. Someday, when I was older and maybe doubting myself again, I'd need to remember this moment, this certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, covering Cleveland in a fresh layer of white that would be gray by morning. But inside my warm kitchen, working on plans to help more families build better futures, I felt the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing your life has meaning beyond yourself. Mrs. Whitman had been right about the sunrise. It always comes, even after the longest nights. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to be part of someone else's dawn. The Henderson Community Learning Center would open its doors again tomorrow, ready to plant more seeds, ready to believe in more potential, ready to prove once again that the best investment you can make is in someone else's dreams. And in that way, Eleanor Whitman's garden would keep growing, season after season, generation after generation, one act of kindness at a time. The newspaper clipping was yellow with age when Destiny Williams found it in her grandmother's attic. But the headline was still clear: Local Woman's Legacy Lives On Through Community Center. The article featured a photo of a man she recognized, Mr. Marcus from the Learning Center, where she'd spent her afternoons throughout middle school. Now 18 and about to start her freshman year at Case Western Reserve University on a full scholarship, Destiny smiled as she read about the check that had started it all, about Mrs. Whitman's faith in a 12-year-old boy, about the chain of kindness that had somehow led to her own success. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Mr. Marcus. Found an old newspaper article about you and Mrs. Whitman. Made me think about how I want to spend my college years. Can we talk about starting a tutoring program at CWRU for kids from the neighborhood? His response came back immediately. Mrs. Whitman would be so proud. When do you want to get started? And so the chain continued, link by link, dream by dream, sunrise after sunrise. 10 years had passed since I'd first opened Mrs. Whitman's card, and the Henderson Community Learning Center had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We now operated 3 locations across Cleveland, served over 800 families annually, and had a waiting list that stretched 6 months out. But success, I'd learned, comes with its own set of challenges. I was sitting in my office on a particularly grey March morning, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller each day. The latest round of state budget cuts had eliminated 2 of our major funding streams, and despite our best efforts, we were facing the possibility of having to close our newest location in the Tremont neighborhood. Marcus? Dr. Chen poked her head through my door, her expression unreadable. At 73, she'd been my anchor through every crisis and celebration, but today, something in her voice made me look up from the spreadsheets that had been giving me a headache for the past 2 hours. There's someone here to see you. Says it's about Eleanor Whitman. My stomach dropped. In 10 years, we'd had researchers, journalists, and even a documentary filmmaker interested in Mrs. Whitman's story, but something about Dr. Chen's tone suggested this was different. The woman waiting in our main lobby was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and clothes that suggested both wealth and understated taste. She looked familiar in a way I couldn't place, like someone you might have seen in passing but never formally met. Mr. Henderson? She stood as I approached, extending a manicured hand. My name is Victoria Whitman Sterling. Eleanor was my aunt. The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my research, in all the conversations with Mr. Peterson, in all the years of running programs inspired by Mrs. Whitman's vision, I had never found any mention of family members. Your aunt? I managed to say, gesturing toward my office. We never knew she had family. Victoria's smile was sad but warm. Eleanor was very private about family matters. We had complications in our relationship that lasted far too long. She settled into the chair across from my desk, her posture perfect but her hands slightly trembling. I've been following the work you've done here for several years, Mr. Henderson. I've been wanting to meet you for quite some time. Following our work? My law firm has been quietly contributing to your annual fundraising campaign since 2019, Whitman Sterling and Associates. We specialize in estate planning and philanthropy law. She paused, seeming to gather herself. I've also been trying to work up the courage to share something with you that I think you need to know. I felt that familiar sensation of my world shifting, the same feeling I'd had when I'd first found the check, when I'd discovered the storage unit, when I'd realized the magnitude of Mrs. Whitman's impact. What is it? Victoria reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, thick and official looking. This is Eleanor's complete will, including several codicils she added in the years before her death. Mr. Peterson handled the basic estate matters, but there were certain provisions that were meant to be activated only under specific circumstances. What kind of circumstances? The successful operation of a community education center in Cleveland for a minimum of 10 years, serving a minimum of 500 families annually, with demonstrated impact on educational outcomes and community development. She looked directly at me. Circumstances that you've not only met, but exceeded. I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. I don't understand. Eleanor left the bulk of her estate to various charities, but she also established what she called the Garden Trust, a fund designed to support the ongoing expansion of community education programs. She believed that if someone could prove the concept worked, could show that investing in people really did create lasting change, then that person deserved the resources to take the work to the next level. Victoria opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. The trust currently holds approximately $2.3 million, accumulated through careful investment of Eleanor's savings and several properties she owned that have appreciated significantly over the past decade. I felt the room spinning slightly. 2.3 million? There are conditions, of course. The money must be used specifically for expanding educational programs that serve economically disadvantaged families. It cannot be used for administrative salaries above a certain percentage, and there must be a commitment to replicating the model in other cities within 5 years. She pulled out another document, this one bearing Mrs. Whitman's familiar handwriting. She also left you this letter to be given only if and when the trust was activated. I took the letter with hands that shook slightly, recognizing the cream-colored stationery that had changed my life a decade earlier. This time, I opened it immediately. "My dearest Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've done something I always knew you would do. You've proven that believing in people really does change the world. I wrote this letter on my 82nd birthday, sitting in my garden one last time before moving to the assisted living facility. I'm looking at the spot where you helped me plant tomatoes when you were 13. Yes, I remember that too. And I'm thinking about all the seeds we plant without knowing which ones will grow into mighty trees. By now you've probably figured out that I had more resources than a retired teacher's pension typically provides. You're right. I inherited money from my parents, invested carefully, lived modestly, and spent 30 years figuring out how to give it away in ways that would create the most lasting impact. The community center was always the test, Marcus. Not a test of your worthiness, I never doubted that, but a test of whether this approach to helping people could work on a larger scale. You've proven that it can. What I'm about to ask of you is bigger than what I asked before. I'm asking you to take this model beyond Cleveland, to plant it in other cities where families like yours are struggling and dreaming and needing someone to believe in their potential. I'm asking you to create a network of community learning centers that can prove once and for all that the best way to break cycles of poverty is to invest in people's capacity to learn, grow, and help each other. I'm asking you to be the person I've always known you were meant to be. Not just a helper, but a leader of helpers. Not just someone who changes lives, but someone who teaches others how to change lives. This won't be easy. You'll face skeptics who think poor people just need to work harder. You'll face bureaucrats who want to control how you help people. You'll face funders who want quick results and simple metrics for complex human problems. But you'll also find allies in places you don't expect. You'll find other people who remember what it felt like to need help and want to make sure help is available. You'll find teachers and social workers and business owners and retirees who've been waiting for someone to show them how to make a real difference. Most importantly, you'll find the families themselves, parents like your mother, kids like you were, who will remind you every day why this work matters. I won't be there to see what you build next, but I have absolute faith that it will be extraordinary, and someday, when you're old and looking back on your life, I hope you'll remember that it all started with a 12-year-old boy who helped an old woman with her groceries and somehow inspired a movement. The garden grows, Marcus. Tend it well. With all my love and infinite faith in your future, Eleanor Whitman. P.S. Check the blue folder in Victoria's briefcase. I may have done a little preliminary research on potential expansion cities. Old habits die hard. I set the letter down and looked at Victoria, who was watching me with eyes that held tears she was trying not to shed. She really planned all of this? Eleanor spent the last 15 years of her life planning this. The trust, the legal framework, the expansion strategy. She thought of everything. Victoria pulled the blue folder from her briefcase and set it on my desk. She even identified potential partners in 12 different cities, researched local needs assessments, and created funding timelines. I opened the folder and found myself looking at a comprehensive expansion plan that rivaled anything a major corporation might develop. Market analyses for Detroit, Milwaukee, Buffalo, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, and 6 other post-industrial cities with demographics similar to Cleveland. Contact information for potential board members, funding sources, and community partners in each location. "How did you know her?" I asked Victoria, still trying to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. Victoria's expression grew complicated. "Eleanor was my father's sister. When I was young, our families were close, but there was a falling out when I was in college. Something to do with my grandfather's will, with money, with pride, the kinds of stupid things that tear families apart and keep them apart long after anyone remembers why they were fighting." She pulled out a photograph. Mrs. Whitman as a young woman, standing next to a man who looked like an older version of Victoria. I spent 30 years being too proud to reach out, too stubborn to admit I'd been wrong, too afraid that she wouldn't forgive me. When she died, I thought I'd lost my chance forever. Victoria's voice caught slightly. But then I started reading about the community center, started understanding what she'd built through you, and I realized that maybe this was my chance to honor her memory and heal the wound I'd carried for so long. That's why you've been contributing to the center. That's why I became a lawyer specializing in philanthropic law. That's why I've spent the last 6 years setting up the legal framework to make this expansion possible. That's why I'm sitting here today, asking if you'll let me help you carry on her work." I looked around my office, at the photos of our students and graduates, at the thank you letters from families whose lives had been changed, at the awards and recognitions that covered one entire wall. All of it had started with a check I'd found in a shoebox, a leap of faith from a woman who'd seen potential in a struggling 12-year-old. "What would this look like practically?" I asked. Victoria's professional demeanor returned, and she pulled out another set of documents. "We'd start with 3 pilot cities, Detroit, Toledo, and Akron, each with similar economic challenges and existing community infrastructure we could build on. The trust would provide seed funding for each location, approximately $200,000 to get started, with additional funding available based on demonstrated results. And my role? You'd become the executive director of the Eleanor Whitman Community Learning Network. You'd train and support local directors, develop standardized curriculum and programming, secure additional funding, and ensure that each location maintains the values and approaches that have made Cleveland successful." It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. For 10 years, I'd focused on making one center as good as it could be. Now I was being asked to create a movement. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but Marcus?" Victoria stood to leave, then turned back. Eleanor believed that some people are meant for small, beautiful lives, and some people are meant for big, complicated ones that change the world. She always said you were meant for the second kind. After Victoria left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at the expansion plan, the legal documents, the photograph of young Eleanor Whitman. Outside my window, I could see our students arriving for afternoon programs, backpacks slung over shoulders, chattering excitedly about whatever they'd learned in school that day. Tommy Foster, now 18 and about to graduate high school, was tutoring a group of younger kids in the computer lab. Destiny Williams was back from her freshman year at Case Western, leading a discussion group about college preparation. Janet Williams, now a registered nurse, was volunteering in our adult education program, helping other parents prepare for their GEDs. The chain Mrs. Whitman had started was already creating its own links, its own branches, its own gardens of possibility. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the group chat with Mrs. Whitman's other investments. I typed, "Just had a meeting that would have made Eleanor very proud. Looks like the garden is about to get a lot bigger." The responses came quickly. "Tell us everything. Ready to help however we can. Eleanor's still planting seeds from heaven. Count me in for whatever you need." I looked at the sunset painting Mrs. Whitman had given me, the one that now hung behind my desk, where I could see it every day. The sunrise always comes, even after the longest nights. Maybe it was time to help the sun rise in other places too. I picked up the phone and dialed Victoria's number. "It's Marcus," I said when she answered. "Let's plant some gardens.